forest was alive with the soft rustling of leaves, the faint chirping of crickets, and the occasional crackle of dry twigs underfoot. It was late afternoon, and the four of us, Evan, Rachel, Marcus, and I, were deep into the woods, far beyond the marked trails. We had planned this trip for weeks, excited to spend a weekend camping under the stars, surrounded by the serenity of nature. The forest had a way of pulling you in, its towering pines and thick undergrowth creating a world entirely separate from the one we left behind. Evan, the de facto leader of our group, was a seasoned hiker. He moved confidently through the dense foliage, occasionally glancing at the map he had brought. Rachel, always cautious, kept an eye on the fading sunlight, her hand never straying far from the flashlight clipped to her belt. Marcus, the joker of the group, lagged slightly behind, snapping pictures of everything from moss-covered rocks to peculiar tree shapes. I brought up the rear, my thoughts drifting as I absorbed the tranquility around us. But as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple, a subtle change crept into the forest. The cheerful chirping of birds grew fainter, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to deepen with every step. Even the wind, which had earlier whispered through the trees, now seemed to hold its breath. We reached a small clearing just as twilight descended, setting up our tents in a rough semicircle around the remnants of an old fire pit. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that hinted at the chill that would soon settle in. Evan started gathering firewood, while Marcus rummaged through his bag for the marshmallows he'd insisted on bringing. Rachel and I worked on the tents, our movements brisk but efficient. By the time the fire crackled to life, the forest around us had grown dark, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The flames cast flickering shadows, their light barely penetrating the surrounding gloom. We huddled close, the warmth of the fire a comforting contrast to the encroaching cold. Laughter came easily at first, stories of past trips, jokes about Marcus's endless selfies. But as the hours passed, a strange unease began to settle over us. It started with the sounds. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible. A soft rustling in the bushes, the creak of a branch bending under some unseen weight. We dismissed them as animals, though none of us could identify what kind. But then came the snapping of twigs, sharp and deliberate, echoing in the stillness. Rachel stiffened, her eyes darting toward the trees. "Probably just a deer," Evan said, his voice calm but low. He tossed another log onto the fire, the sparks flying upward like tiny fireflies. Rachel nodded, though she didn't look convinced. Marcus grinned and grabbed his flashlight. "Maybe Bigfoot's out there. Want me to invite him to join us?" "Not funny," Rachel snapped, her tone sharper than usual. She was usually the one to laugh at Marcus's antics, but tonight her nerves were frayed. As the night wore on, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. The shadows seemed to shift just beyond the firelight, shapes flitting between the trees. At one point, Evan stood abruptly, his hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife strapped to his hip. Did anyone hear that? We fell silent, straining our ears. At first, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire. Then faintly came a sound, a low, mournful whistle, rising and falling like a ghostly melody carried on the wind. It was distant, but unmistakable, and it sent a chill down my spine. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered, his bravado gone. Evan shook his head. "It could be the wind, or I don't know." The whistle came again, closer this time. Rachel clutched her flashlight, her knuckles white. "We should pack up and leave," she said, her voice trembling. "Now." Evan hesitated, his eyes scanning the darkness. "It's probably nothing," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "If If we start moving in the dark, we could get lost. Let's wait until morning." No one argued, but the decision brought little comfort. We extinguished the fire, retreating to our tents in tense silence. I lay awake for what felt like hours, my ears attuned to every sound. The whistle came again, haunting and persistent, but now it was joined by something else, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. At some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the tent was suffused with the pale light of dawn. Relieved, I stepped outside, expecting to see the others already up. Instead, I found Evan standing near the edge of the clearing, staring at something in the distance. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to me, his face pale. "Come look." I joined him, my stomach nodding as I followed his gaze. There, just beyond the clearing, stood a line of crude wooden figures, each one resembling a human form. They were small, no taller than a foot, but their crude construction and eerie placement sent a wave of unease through me. Their hollow eyes seemed to watch us, their twisted forms casting long shadows in the morning light. The others soon emerged, their reactions mirroring my own. Rachel's hands shook as she clutched her flashlight, and Marcus, for once, was at a loss for words. "Let's go," Evan said, his tone brooking no argument. We packed in record time, abandoning anything we couldn't carry. The hike back was a blur, our usual banter replaced by a grim silence. The forest, so inviting just a day ago, now seemed oppressive, its shadows stretching longer than they should. But the feeling of being watched never left us, and the whistling, low, mournful, and relentless, followed us all the way back to the edge of the forest. As we pushed deeper into the forest on our hurried retreat, the unease only grew. The trail that had felt so clear on the way in now seemed tangled, unfamiliar, as though the forest itself had shifted overnight. Every tree looked the same, dark trunks stretching endlessly upward, their gnarled branches interlocking like skeletal fingers. The faint sunlight struggled to pierce through the dense canopy, casting everything in a dim, grayish hue. Evan took the lead, his map clutched tightly in one hand, while the other rested on the knife at his side. Rachel walked beside me, her eyes darting nervously to the shadows, and Marcus brought up the rear, unusually quiet. The silence between us was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional snap of a distant branch. As the morning stretched on, it became clear that something was wrong. The trail twisted unnaturally, looping back on itself in ways that defied logic. The more we walked, the more it felt as though we were being drawn in circles, the forest's geography rearranging itself to trap us. Evan cursed under his breath, his frustration mounting with every step. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered, stopping to study the map again. "We should have reached the main trail by now." "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. She hugged her arms tightly to her chest, as though trying to ward off the growing chill. "I'm sure," Evan snapped, though his tone betrayed his doubt. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees. "This doesn't match up with the map. Something's off. Maybe we should just head east," Marcus suggested, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. "Follow the sun. It'll lead us out eventually, right?" Evan hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, let's try that." We adjusted our course, but the unease remained. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth thick and clawing at our legs as we pushed through. The air felt heavier, colder, as though the trees were pressing closer together. And then there were the sounds. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling that seemed to follow us no matter which direction we turned. came the whispers. Low and unintelligible, they rose and fell with the wind, always just out of reach. It wasn't the sound of animals or the creaking of branches. It was human, or at least it sounded like it. Rachel stopped abruptly, her hand shooting out to grab my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, my throat dry. The others had stopped too, their faces pale. Evan tightened his grip on his knife, his knuckles white. "It's just the wind," he said, though none of us believed him. The whispers grew louder as we pressed on, more insistent. They seemed to come from every direction, weaving through the trees and circling us like invisible predators. Occasionally, they would rise into faint laughter, soft and mocking, as though amused by our growing panic. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, a figure darting between the trees, too quick and too far away to make out clearly. But it was enough to stop us in our tracks. Evan raised a hand, signaling for us to stay quiet. We huddled together, our eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. "There's someone out there," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Evan shook his head. "We don't know that. It could be." The sound of snapping branches cut him off, loud and deliberate. It came from somewhere to our left, too close for comfort. We turned as one, our breaths hitching. But the forest was empty, or at least it appeared to be. The shadows seemed to ripple, the spaces between the trees shifting like something unseen was moving through them. "Let's keep moving," Evan said, his voice tight. "Stay close." We obeyed, our steps quickening as fear drove us forward. But the figure, or figures, continued to follow, always just at the edge of our vision. Sometimes there was one. Other times, there seemed to be many, their shapes flickering like mirages in the shadows. They moved with an unnatural grace, silent except for the occasional crack of a branch or the faint rustle of leaves. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the laughter until they became an almost deafening cacophony. They spoke in a language none of us recognized, their words guttural and otherworldly. I clutched Rachel's arm, my nails digging into her sleeve as the sense of dread deepened. Then, without warning, the forest opened up into another clearing. At its center stood something that made my blood run cold, a massive tree, its trunk twisted and blackened as though burned. Around its base were more of the crude wooden figures we had seen earlier, but these were larger, their features more defined. Their hollow eyes stared at us, their mouths twisted into grotesque grins. "What the hell is this?" Marcus breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. We stood frozen, our eyes locked on the scene before us. The air around the tree was thick, heavy with an unexplainable energy that made it hard to breathe. The whispers were louder here, their voices overlapping and merging into a chorus of incomprehensible sounds. Evan took a hesitant step forward, his knife raised. "We need to keep moving," he said, though his voice wavered. "Just go around it. Don't..." A loud crack echoed through the clearing, and we all spun around. The sound had come from behind us, from the direction we had just come. But there was nothing there, only the dense wall of trees. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though urging us to stay. Rachel grabbed my hand, her grip trembling. "We shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice breaking. "We need to leave, now." Evan nodded, his jaw clenched. "Let's go. Stick together." But as we turned to leave, the forest seemed to close in on us, the shadows deepening and the path disappearing entirely. The figures in the clearing remained still, yet it felt as though their eyes were following us, their twisted grins growing wider as we retreated. And then, just as we stepped back into the trees, the laughter began again. This time, It wasn't faint or distant. It was all around us, loud, echoing, and utterly inhuman. The laughter echoed through the forest, sharp and unnatural, as though the trees themselves were mocking us. It rose and fell in eerie waves, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My legs felt like lead, every step forward an effort against the growing sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. The others were silent now, their faces pale and drawn as we trudged through the thick undergrowth, our breaths coming in shallow, uneven gasps. Evan led the way, his knife held tightly in one hand, the other gripping the strap of his backpack, as though it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. Rachel walked beside me, her hand gripping my arm so tightly that her nails bit into my skin. Behind us, Marcus kept glancing over his shoulder, his wide eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The path, or what we thought was a path, grew narrower, the trees pressing closer together until their twisted branches formed a canopy so dense that only faint slivers of light managed to penetrate. The air felt thicker here, heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. My lungs burned with every breath, and my heart pounded so loudly that it drowned out all other sounds. And then, the whispers started again. They were faint at first, like the rustling of leaves, but as we moved deeper into the forest, they grew louder, more distinct. The voices overlapped, creating a discordant symphony that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. I couldn't understand the words, if they were even words, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, malevolent, and all too aware of our presence. "Keep moving," Evan said, his voice low and strained. He didn't look back, his focus fixed on the barely visible trail ahead. Don't stop, don't look back, but it was impossible not to. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, an oppressive weight that pressed down on my shoulders and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't shake the sense that something was following us, its presence just beyond the edge of the firelight. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a flicker of shadow, the briefest hint of a figure darting between the trees. But whenever I turned to look, there was nothing. Rachel's grip on my arm tightened as the whispers grew louder, their tone shifting from mocking to something more sinister. It was as though the forest itself was alive, its roots and branches conspiring to trap us, to pull us deeper into its labyrinth of shadows. And then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to reverberate through the ground beneath our feet. It came from somewhere ahead of us, cutting through the cacophony of whispers like a knife. Evan froze, his body tense as he scanned the darkness. "What was that?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "Just an animal," Evan said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. "Probably a wolf or—" Another growl interrupted him, louder this time, closer. It was followed by a sound that sent a chill down my spine, a slow, deliberate scraping, like claws dragging across bark. "We need to go back," Marcus said, his voice trembling. He turned, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but the trail behind us was gone. In its place was a wall of trees, their twisted trunks packed so tightly together that there was no way through. Panic set in. Rachel let out a small, choked sob, and even Evan's mask of control began to crack. He turned in a slow circle, his knife raised, as though expecting something to lunge at us from the shadows. "We stick together," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happens, we stay together." But the forest had other plans. The ground beneath our feet shifted suddenly, as though the very earth was alive. I stumbled, grabbing onto Rachel to steady myself, but the sensation was unmistakable, a subtle, rhythmic pulsing, like a heartbeat. "What the hell is was happening?" Marcus cried, his flashlight beam shaking as he scanned the trees. The whispers had grown deafening now, merging into a single droning hum that made my head throb. And then, through the cacophony, came a new sound, a soft, childlike giggle. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the whispers, but it grew louder with every passing second. It was playful, almost innocent, but there was something deeply wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. The laughter seemed to come from all around us, echoing through the trees, and then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that it seemed to press against my ears. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. It was small, no taller than a child, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, twin pinpricks of pale light that seemed to pierce through me. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Rachel nodded, her face pale. "What is it?" Evan turned, his knife raised, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us, its glowing eyes unblinking. And then, slowly, it smiled. The smile was impossibly wide, stretching across its face like a wound. I took a step back, my legs shaking, but the figure remained still. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the sense of malice radiating from it was overwhelming. And then, without warning, it was gone. One moment it was there, and the next, the shadows swallowed it whole. "We need to run," Evan said, his voice shaking. "Now." But before we could take a step, the ground beneath us shifted again, more violently this time. Roots burst from the earth, twisting and writhing like living things. They snaked toward us, their gnarled ends reaching for our ankles, and the forest came alive with the sound of cracking wood and rustling leaves. I grabbed Rachel's hand, pulling her forward as we ran blindly into the darkness. The whispers rose into a deafening roar, the laughter chasing us like a specter. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at our clothes and faces, but we didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. The forest was alive with movement, but we couldn't see it. The air around us was thick enough to make every breath feel like an effort. We ran without thinking, our feet pounding against the earth, branches and brambles clawing at our clothes, at our skin. The whispers still echoed in our ears, but now they were louder, sharper, cutting through the fog of our panic. They were everywhere, around us, inside our heads, and through it all, that low, steady hum persisted, like the pulse of the forest itself, a heartbeat we could feel in the very ground beneath us. Rachel stumbled ahead of me, her breath ragged. I tried to keep pace, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Behind us, Marcus's flashlight flickered weakly, casting long, jittery shadows across the trees. The dark seemed to swallow the light whole, the forest more oppressive with every step. "Evan," Rachel gasped. "Where the hell are we going?" Evan's face was drawn tight with concentration. His eyes flicked from the trees to the map in his hand, though it was hard to make sense of anything anymore. The landscape had twisted in ways we couldn't explain. The path we thought we were following had long disappeared, leaving us with no sense of direction. The only constant was the forest, its dense canopy, its suffocating darkness. It felt as though it was closing in on us, like the trees were leaning in, pressing us deeper into its heart. "I don't know," Evan muttered. "I don't know. We just need to keep moving." I wanted to scream, to say that it was hopeless, that whatever had been following us, the shadow, the whispers, the unnatural stillness, was already inside us, inside the very air we were breathing. But I couldn't. I couldn't form the words. I couldn't breathe. The forest shifted again, as if in response to our panic. The sound of our hurried footsteps, the rustling of the leaves, the frantic breathing, they all seemed to blend into one sound. But beneath it, a new noise began to take shape. A soft, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, deep and echoing. It was steady, but it grew louder with each passing second, as if it were coming closer. Marcus was the first to notice. He slowed for just a moment, the light from his flashlight sweeping the darkness around us. His voice was trembling when he spoke. Do you hear that?" I nodded, my throat too tight to answer. The heartbeat wasn't in the air. It was in the ground, in the trees, in the very fabric of the forest itself. It pulsed, steady and unyielding, as though the forest had a life of its own. The trees around us creaked, groaned, their trunks shifting and stretching, as if they too were alive and growing. The shadows in the periphery seemed to swell and contract like breathing lungs, and with each breath, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing just at the edge of the light, barely visible, but unmistakable. A figure too small to be a man, but too large to be a child, its limbs too long, too twisted, its head hanging low, cocked at an unnatural angle. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was watching us again, its glowing eyes peering from the darkness like two burning coals. The smile, those wide, grotesque lips stretching impossibly far, was back. "Guys," I gasped, pulling Rachel's arm. "It's here. It's..." Before I could finish, the figure was gone, vanishing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. The heartbeat grew louder. Evan cursed under his breath and picked up the pace, though I could see the doubt in his eyes. He kept looking behind us, his face pale, his grip on the knife tightening. I caught a fleeting glimpse of Marcus, his face white, his flashlight trembling in his hand. We were all afraid, more than afraid, terrified. But none of us dared stop running. None of us dared to look back. I didn't know how much time had passed since we'd started running. The forest had become a blur, trees, shadows, undergrowth, everything twisted together, an endless maze. The world felt unreal, like we were trapped in some fevered nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. The ground beneath us began to rise, a steep incline cutting into our path. We scrambled up it, desperate to get away from whatever was following us, from whatever had made the trees shudder and creak, from whatever had whispered our names in the dark. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the heartbeat stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. It was so quiet that the very air seemed to press against our ears. The wind had died, the forest still, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. The oppressive weight of the silence sank into my chest, choking off any attempt at calm, at reason. It was too quiet, too still. Evan was the first to speak. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "This isn't right. A twig snapped behind us. We all froze. I turned, my flashlight flicking across the trees, but there was nothing but the shadows, stretched long by the dimming light. The sound of the snap echoed through the forest, and then a voice, soft, almost too soft to be real. "Help!" It was a child's voice calling from the darkness, sweet and pleading. A voice that didn't belong in the woods, a voice that didn't belong anywhere. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a weight in the air that made my stomach churn. "Did you hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice thin, strained. Evan didn't answer. He was already moving, pushing ahead, his feet crunching against the dry leaves. I wanted to follow, to run with him, but something held me in place, a cold feeling spreading through my limbs like ice water. The voice had come from just ahead of us, but there was no way I was going back to investigate. Please, help. It came again, this time more insistent, more desperate. The whisper of the leaves around us seemed to shift in response to it, as though the forest itself were listening, waiting for us to make our move. Don't stop, Evan called out, his voice cracking. Move. But my feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. Every part of me wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The voice had stopped now, but the tension in the air had only increased. Every moment felt like we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't see, but we could feel. Something coming closer, slowly, methodically, relentlessly. And then the whispers returned. Only they weren't whispers anymore. They were words, faint at first, but growing clearer with every breath. We see you. It was the same voice as before, the voice of the child, but it had changed, twisted somehow. The words echoed around us, but they didn't seem to come from any one place. They were all around us, all at once, and the words carried an unmistakable malice, a threat that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Evan turned again, his flashlight sweeping the trees, but it was like looking into a void. There was nothing, only the darkness pressing in, suffocating us. We see you, the voice repeated, this time louder, sharper. The words were no longer just a whisper, they were a command. Something stirred in the shadows, something big, something far too close. We were no longer alone. The tension in the air was unbearable. Every sound seemed amplified, each crack of a twig, every gust of wind that shook the branches above us. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was even worse. It clung to the trees, hung in the air like an invisible fog, and it felt as though it were slowly suffocating us. Evan's flashlight flickered erratically, casting long, jittery shadows on the surrounding trunks. I could hear his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. He was barely holding it together, and I didn't blame him. None of us were. But despite the panic bubbling in my chest, I couldn't move. It was as though my feet were rooted to the spot, unwilling to venture any farther into the dark unknown. I don't understand, Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. She took a step back, clutching her arms around herself. We were just trying to leave. Why is it following us? Her words were a sharp reminder of how lost we were, how wrong everything had gone. We hadn't meant to stumble into whatever cursed place this was. We had come here for a simple hike, some time away from the world, but now we were trapped, caught in a forest that felt more like a living thing, with eyes everywhere and something watching us, waiting for us to slip. I don't know, Evan said, his voice strained as he turned in another slow circle, scanning the trees. He was clutching the map so tightly that I thought it might tear in his hands. But we have to keep moving. The words sounded hollow, empty. We were no longer following a path, no longer even sure of which direction we were going. The trees were too thick, the shadows too deep. There was no more sunlight to guide us, no familiar landmarks. We were in a maze, and the walls were closing in. The ground beneath us seemed to shift again, the earth buckling slightly beneath our feet, making the air feel thick, like it was resisting our every movement. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in from all sides, pushing us closer together. The trees towered overhead, their trunks so twisted and gnarled that they looked as if they were reaching out to grab us, their branches clawing at the sky in desperate agony. And still, that presence was there. I could feel it, watching. A subtle rustling came from the dark corner of my eye, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something move between the trees. Something large, shadowed, lurking just beyond the light's reach. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, and I spun, searching the darkness, but nothing was there. Nothing but the thickening blackness. "What's going on?" Marcus's voice cracked, breaking the tense silence. He sounded on the verge of hysteria. "What is this place? It feels wrong. Everything feels wrong." "We need to move," Evan repeated, his voice tight with barely concealed panic. He grabbed the front of Marcus's jacket and pulled him along. "Now." But as we moved forward, the forest seemed to stretch out before us, the trees growing taller, the shadows darker. The very air felt heavier, thick with an unnatural weight. And then, without warning, the sounds returned. Faint at first, like a far-off murmur. But as we moved deeper into the forest, it grew louder. It was the whispers again, but they were different this time. Closer, more distinct. Not just in the wind, but in our minds. I could hear them. Voices, low and guttural, whispering words I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to move with us, circling us like predators. The rustling in the trees shifted, but not like before. This wasn't the wind. This was deliberate, purposeful, like something was moving through the branches, just out of reach. Slowly, the whispers seemed to take shape, the words becoming clearer, rising in pitch, growing louder until they became a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "We see you." It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command, a cold, terrifying pronouncement. The words echoed in my skull, making my head spin, reverberating in the stillness of the night. "Keep moving," Evan said again, his voice barely audible over the increasing noise. His face was pale, his eyes wild. It was clear he wasn't thinking clearly anymore. His movements were erratic, like he was trying to outrun something that had already caught up to him. But we couldn't outrun it. The forest felt alive, like it was responding to us, pushing against us. The trees seemed to lean in closer, the air thick with an unnatural fog that clung to everything, coating our skin, our breath. Every movement felt sluggish, weighed down by an unseen force. The path ahead was impossible to see through the growing darkness, but it didn't matter. The forest had already swallowed us whole. And then, just as the voices reached a fever pitch, they stopped. It was like someone had turned off the switch. The forest fell silent. The air, once thick with dread, became suffocatingly still. But something was wrong. I could feel it in my chest, an oppressive pressure, a heaviness that sank deeper into my bones with each passing second. I don't like this," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. She was practically leaning against me now, her eyes wide, darting back and forth in fear. "Something's wrong. She didn't finish the sentence. A figure appeared, just at the edge of the light, standing perfectly still. It was not human. It was something else, something twisted and unnatural. A figure too tall, too thin, its limbs too long, reaching out like branches of a tree. The pale light of Evan's flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows that danced around it. I couldn't make out its features at first, only the shape. The darkness clung to it, surrounding it like a shroud, leaving its form almost indistinguishable from the shadows. It didn't move, it didn't speak, but it was there. Evan tightened his grip on his knife, stepping forward, but he looked unsure, uncertain of what to do next. We all stood frozen, staring at the figure. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't natural. It felt wrong. It felt like something that shouldn't exist in this world. It felt like it was waiting for us. Then, as if sensing our fear, the figure took a slow step forward. The sound was faint, a soft, sickening crunch of dry leaves underfoot. And with that movement, the forest seemed to shift again, the trees groaning in response, the ground beneath us trembling slightly, as if the very earth were waking up, aware of our presence. The figure's head tilted slowly, unnaturally, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was staring directly at me, staring into my soul. And then the whispers returned. They weren't just voices, they were thoughts. My thoughts, my deepest fears and anxieties, my secrets, my regrets, all of it flooding my mind at once, overwhelming, suffocating. The voices were inside me now, and I couldn't escape them. "We see you." The figure moved again, closer this time, its shape growing clearer, the shadows that clung to it like smoke fading just enough to reveal a grotesque, elongated silhouette. It was not human. It could not be human. My legs shook beneath me, but I couldn't move. We were trapped. The forest had trapped us. The figure was real, and whatever it was, it had been waiting for us. It had always been waiting. There was no way out. The forest was silent again, but the silence felt heavier now, as if the weight of the world had settled on our shoulders. I could hear nothing but the blood pounding in my ears and the rasp of my breath. The figure was still there, standing just beyond the range of the flashlight's weak beam, but it wasn't moving anymore. It was watching us. No, it wasn't just watching us. It was waiting. I couldn't see its face, not clearly. The shadows around it seemed to cling to it, wrapping around it like a cloak, distorting its shape so that it appeared to flicker between different forms. Sometimes it seemed taller, sometimes shorter, but always just outside of comprehension. A trick of the light, or something worse. My heart was racing. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. There was something magnetic about the figure, something that held me in place, frozen, as if my body had forgotten how to move. I wasn't the only one. Rachel was beside me, her back pressed against a tree, her eyes wide, breath shallow. Marcus was to my left, clutching his flashlight like a weapon, but I could tell by the way his hand trembled that he wasn't sure if it would be enough. We need to leave," Rachel whispered, but it wasn't a suggestion. It was a plea. Her voice was thin, fragile, as if she feared speaking too loudly would make the figure in the shadows react. But nothing happened. Not at first. The figure didn't move. The forest around us didn't change. But the air felt thicker, almost suffocating. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for us to make the next move. My eyes kept darting between the figure and the dark, endless expanse of trees that stretched in every direction. The forest felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain, like it had been altered, corrupted by something ancient and malevolent. I couldn't stand it anymore. I took a step back, the dry leaves crunching under my boots like a warning, but I couldn't help it. I needed to move, needed to put space between myself and whatever that thing was. It felt like my chest was tightening, the pressure growing unbearable. My body screamed at me to flee, to run in any direction that wasn't this one, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. They were shaking too much. Evan, who had been silent for far too long, shifted nervously. He looked from the figure to the forest behind us, his mind racing, but I could see the panic in his eyes. The steady, confident leader he had been when we started this hike had vanished, replaced by someone who wasn't sure which way was safe anymore. "Stay calm," Evan said, his voice hoarse. He wasn't looking at any of us anymore. His eyes were locked on the dark shape in the distance. "We can still make it out of here. Just stay together." But his words didn't offer comfort. They didn't change the fact that we were being hunted. The very air around us seemed to thicken, pressing in with every second that passed. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, a cold shiver running down my spine, a gnawing instinct that told me to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. We couldn't. The forest wouldn't let us. The figure began to move, but it didn't approach. It simply shifted, its limbs elongating, twisting unnaturally, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It was as though its form was bending and stretching like a shadow pulled by the wind. The movement was slow, deliberate, calculated. It wasn't coming toward us. No, it was circling us. And the longer I watched, the more I felt that we were the prey, not the other way around. The whispers began again, low at first, and then growing louder, more distinct. They were everywhere, in the trees, in the air, in my head. "We see you." I felt the words settle into my chest, as though they were not spoken but planted, a seed in the soil of my mind, taking root and spreading. The voice wasn't just a voice anymore. It was a presence, something that had always been there, something that knew me, knew all of us. The whispers weren't from the figure, not entirely. It felt like the forest itself was speaking to us, wrapping its tendrils around our minds, pulling us closer to something. I turned to Evan, my eyes wide with terror. "What is it? What the hell is that thing?" But he didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the shifting figure, his mouth barely moving as he muttered something under his breath, too soft to hear. I couldn't make sense of it. Behind me, I heard Rachel's breath catch in her throat. I whipped around, heart pounding, expecting to see something moving, something coming for us. But no. The figure was still there, still circling, but it was closer. The shadows around it had deepened, and now it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something else, something alive. The edges of its form seemed to shimmer in the light from the flashlights, like heat rising from pavement. The shape was getting clearer. Its limbs no longer seemed to bend or twist, but lengthened unnaturally, like the branches of a tree reaching toward us. My mind was racing, every thought a scream. Something about the shape, the way it moved, felt wrong on a level I couldn't comprehend. It was inhuman. Not in the sense of being a creature from another world, but in the sense that it didn't belong in this reality. It was out of place, a disturbance in the very fabric of nature. I turned back to the others, desperate to say something, but the words caught in my throat. The air was too thick, the pressure too much. And then, as though sensing my fear, the figure stopped moving. It was still, utterly still, like a statue frozen in time. But even though it wasn't moving, I could feel it watching me, feel its presence in every corner of the forest. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to look away. There was something magnetic about it, something that made me feel like I had no choice. Rachel's voice broke through the fog of terror. What does it want from us? Why isn't it doing anything? Her words hung in the air, unanswered. There was no reply, not from the figure, not from the forest. Only the oppressive silence. The tension was unbearable. Every second that passed felt like an eternity. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, suffocating me, and I couldn't tell if it was the forest or the figure or something deeper within me that was causing this slow, creeping dread. And then, a sudden rustle, a snap of a branch. It came from behind us. We all spun, our hearts racing, flashlights trembling in our hands. But there was nothing. The The forest was still, too still. The rustling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, but the chill remained, hanging thick in the air. But it wasn't just the absence of sound that was terrifying. It was the presence of something in the silence. A weight, a pull. We were being watched, and we could feel it, like a hand gripping the back of our necks, tightening with every breath we took. Marcus let out a strangled laugh, one that didn't sound human at all. This isn't real," he muttered, his voice thin and shaky. "None of this is real." But it was real. It was all too real. The figure began to move again, but this time, it wasn't just circling. It was coming closer, slower now, but with intent. The shadows around it seemed to pulse, shifting like living things. It was alive, moving like something that wasn't bound by the same rules as us. I turned away from the figure for just a moment to glance at the others. They were as terrified as I was, eyes wide, bodies rigid with fear. But there was nowhere to go. We were trapped in the center of the forest, and whatever this thing was, it was closing in. And still, the whispers continued. Louder now, closer now, more distinct. "We see you." The whispers had become a constant now, a chorus of voices that swirled around us, each one indistinguishable from the other, but still intimately familiar. They weren't just words anymore. They were thoughts. Thoughts that weren't my own. Thoughts that weren't anyone's. They bled together, twisted, bent into something unrecognizable. My head felt heavy, as if the weight of the entire forest was pressing down on me, pulling me into the earth beneath my feet. "We see you." I couldn't escape them. Every inch of the forest felt like it was alive, like it was watching, waiting for us to break. The trees seemed to close in tighter with each step we took, the shadows growing longer and darker. We were no longer walking on a path. There were no paths anymore. There was only the thickening darkness that wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket. Evan's flashlight flickered again, its beam casting long, trembling shadows across the forest floor. His grip on it was shaking, his knuckles white. He was no longer leading us with the same determination. His steps were hesitant, unsure, his gaze darting nervously to the trees as though he expected them to move, to reach out and grab him. "Keep moving," he muttered, though his voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb the thick silence that now engulfed us. "We need to keep moving." But there was no way to move without feeling the weight of something following. There was nothing left to do but walk, trapped in a loop of fear that refused to loosen its grip on us. Behind me, Rachel was breathing heavily, her eyes wild with panic. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched with every rustle of leaves, every gust of wind that made the branches sway above. I knew she felt it too. The presence. It was everywhere. It was in the trees, in the air, in the ground beneath us. It was pressing in from all sides, suffocating, consuming. And then, just as we had passed what felt like the 50th twisted tree, the whispers stopped. Silence. The sudden quiet was almost more terrifying than the voices had been. It was too still, the kind of stillness that made every sound, every breath, every rustle of clothing seem painfully loud. I couldn't breathe without hearing it. I couldn't move without feeling the weight of the silence press against me. It felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. Did it stop? Marcus asked, his voice shaking as he looked around, his eyes wide. I could tell he was desperate for an explanation, anything to explain why the world had gone so still, so unnatural. "I don't know," Evan replied, his voice hollow. He looked around, his face pale in the dim light of his flashlight. His eyes were darting from one shadow to the next, as if waiting for something to leap out of the darkness. But we need to stay together. We all nodded, but it was clear none of us were really listening. The forest had swallowed us whole, and we were drifting, lost in the middle of it, like ants trapped in a maze of towering trees. Another gust of wind stirred the branches overhead, but it didn't bring any relief. Instead, it only made the air feel colder, sharper. The trees groaned as if protesting the intrusion, their bark scraping against each other in a slow, almost mournful rhythm. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, the more the forest seemed to know us, to understand us in ways that weren't possible. Suddenly, the figure reappeared. It wasn't a silhouette anymore. It had taken shape, clearer, sharper, more distinct. There was no mistaking it now. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated, stretching beyond the natural proportions of any human form. Its body was distorted, like a living nightmare crafted from shadows, and yet it radiated something else, something ancient. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, like roots of a tree grown in the wrong direction, each movement slow, deliberate, as though it were toying with us. It was close now, close enough that I could see the faint shimmer of its outline in the flashlight's beam, its form flickering like a mirage. But it wasn't moving toward us. It was standing still, just like before, watching, waiting. "We see you." The words weren't spoken, not really. They entered me. They surrounded me. The voice was inside my mind, inside all of our minds. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a presence. It was the forest itself, and it was alive. It was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake, to slip, to break. And then, for the first time since we had entered the woods, I felt the ground beneath my feet shift. It wasn't a sudden movement, but a slow, imperceptible change, like the earth itself was breathing, like the forest was alive and shifting in response to our presence. The air became thick with something unnameable, a heavy pressure that made it feel like the very atmosphere was closing in. I could feel it on my skin, crawling beneath my clothes, suffocating me. The forest was no longer just a place. It had become a living entity, its very essence alive, with hunger, with waiting. I turned to Rachel, my mouth dry, my heart pounding. "We need to get out of here, now." She didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed ahead, her face pale, her lips trembling. I followed her gaze. The figure was moving again, slowly, so slowly that I wasn't sure if it was moving at all, or if it was my mind playing tricks on me. But it was moving. The way it shifted, its limbs stretching, bending, growing. The shadows around it swirled like smoke, obscuring its form and then revealing it again in distorted, grotesque shapes. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was circling us, and with each step, it drew closer. I couldn't take my eyes off it. There was something in that form that felt like it was pulling at the very fibers of my soul. It wasn't a figure of flesh and bone. It was something else, something old, something ancient, a manifestation of the forest's will, a thing that had been waiting for us, waiting for me. The others were frozen too, their eyes locked on the figure as it approached. The whispers grew louder, but now they were no longer just words. They were thoughts, screams, whispers of things unsaid, things we couldn't comprehend. They rattled in my skull, gnawing at my sanity, tearing at the fragile threads of my mind. "We see you." The figure stopped in front of us. We were so close now that I could feel the cold emanating from it, the darkness wrapping around it like a shroud. My pulse raced, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the figure had rooted me to the spot, tethered me to it with invisible strings. Evan's hand tightened around his flashlight, but even his grip was slipping now. I could see the tremors in his arms, the panic in his eyes. He was no longer the leader. He was just as afraid as the rest of us. I tried to take a step back, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing in on all sides. There was no escape. And still, the figure did not move. It stood there in front of us, watching, waiting. For what? I didn't know, and I didn't want to know, but I felt it. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a collective howl that rattled in my bones. And then, in the suffocating silence that followed, I heard it. A crack, a snap, a branch breaking. I spun toward the sound, my heart racing. But there was nothing there, just the same forest, the same darkness, and the same figure still standing, waiting. And we were still trapped, forever watching, forever waiting.